When I was a minister in a traditionally Christian church, I preached from the lectionary, which is, as you may know, a set of prescribed scriptures from which to preach each Sunday. I compare it to shopping at Safeway. There's plenty to explore, and you may well see something new every trip. I feel like I did, but you can find your way around pretty easily. It's comfortable. You know where things are. For a Unitarian Universalist minister, preaching is more like a visit to IKEA. On Monday, you sort of stand in the lobby and you look at all the options and you don't know whether to skip with joy or collapse into a weeping puddle. There are so many departments, so many sources of inspiration that you could spend just a month in the Taoism department, which has a hidden shortcut to the Judaism department, if you know where to look. Sermon material can be found in any of these places. Today I want to spend some time with you in the history section, perusing the history of the witches' Sabbath. I think we can draw parallels to our own time. So a long period of economic growth, cultural growth in Western Europe was slowing in the 1300s. But the economic slowdown was only part of the problem. Climate changes were causing longer, colder winters, followed by torrential rains in the spring and summer. Day-to-day life, history tells us, could be bleak. And worse, there was less and less food available as the growing season became shorter and shorter and shorter. Scott Hedricks, who is assistant professor of history at Carroll University, wrote about that time period in a paper he called The Pursuit of Witches and the Sexual Discourse of the Sabbath. It's worth a read. You can find it online. He says, as if that were not bad enough, the rains destroyed many crops in the field, while encouraging the growth of parasitical fungi that made much of what was left inedible. Furthermore, the poor weather contributed to the development of diseases in cattle and horses, some of which could be passed on to humans, further reducing both the food supply and the supply of draft animals necessary to plow, harvest, and transport grain. The result of all these things in combination was the loss of roughly 1/3 of the population of Europe to starvation and hunger-related illnesses. Children who grew up in that environment developed compromised immune systems, Hedricks goes on to say later. So when the Black Death arrived in Italy in the 1340s, it found easy prey and eventually wiped out another third of Europe's population, an estimated 25 million people. Family bonds were pushed to the limit and often broken as people who were infected were, out of necessity, abandoned by their families. Hedricks reports that at a time when the people's need for spiritual support was at its peak, the clergy died in even greater numbers than the general population, as many dedicated priests and friars remained in close contact with those who were ill and dying due to their effort to provide comfort, or at least the solace of last rites. Though the worst effects of this disease were felt between 1347 and 1351, recurrent outbreaks, he says, would ravage European populations until 1666. It's not surprising that in that environment people began to fear that the end of the world was near. The job of religion, whether it's the Catholicism of the Middle Ages or today's Unitarian Universalism, the job is to make meaning of life, to interpret the contemporary setting in light of deeply held values and beliefs. So the church went to work interpreting, and theologians began to ascribe all this death and misery to Satan, who, in his way, was a scapegoat. Satan was pictured as prowling the earth, looking for people to tempt into evil. The Inquisition was the church's attempt to rid the world of Satan and Satan's human agents. Of the about 100,000 people inquisitors persecuted, 75% were women. Inquisitors turned over 60,000 people to be executed. there's more than one reason women were singled out. Two big ones are men's sexual insecurities. Witches were accused of making men unable to perform sexually. It was probably their high-fat, almost all-meat diet, which caused blood pressure problems, but it's easier. Yeah. Than going on a diet, I guess. But the second reason that women were singled out, another reason rather, was the practice of herbal healing, which the church eventually came to call witchcraft. Since most peasants, at least, couldn't afford a physician, they went to healers for help with sicknesses, healers who were almost exclusively women. This again from Hendricks. For example, an individual afflicted by aches and pains might receive a tea with ingredients gathered under a full moon and blended while the wise woman uttered an incantation to draw out the hidden powers of these ingredients, which might include willow bark, a natural source of aspirin. One need not believe in the effectiveness of the healing incantation applied in order to understand how such a remedy could ease pain. End quote. What's more, almost half of all children during this period died before the age of 10. And people blamed their children's caretakers and these healers, whom they called on when their children were sick, the wise women, as they were often called. As I said a moment ago, the church set out via the Inquisition to fix the perceived evil that was causing these horrors in their society. So inquisitors traveled to towns and villages to seek out and punish evildoers who had clearly made some pact with Satan. At first, the church ordered the inquisitors only to punish witchcraft or healing practices, as they probably should be called, if they involved Christian heresies, and they didn't always. But by the end of the 14th century, the church declared healing magic and all these practices heretical. Since, as I said just a second ago, they said they must involve implicit deals with the devil. After that ruling, inquisitors were free to persecute witchcraft without any other sort of evidence of heresy. Peasant women who had been practicing healing magic were now vulnerable to torture and execution. And the term witch was born. Hendricks again. What we have in the term witch is a category of person created by the clerical elite in Europe, that of the witch, an apostate who had made a pact with Satan, which would then be imposed over the identities of these people who had never thought of themselves in these terms. And the concept of the witch's Sabbath developed as a useful mechanism for spreading awareness of the conspiracy of witches that many among the clerical elite firmly believed existed and was responsible for the horrible string of disasters recurring periodically across the continent. So the clergy began spreading tales of a witch's Sabbath. Tales which, by the way, most of them seem to have believed was true. I don't know how you can tell that. They seem sincerely misguided to me. As the story went, a group of women would fly to an agreed-upon location. They might fly there in their human form or in their cat form. They would be joined by a pack of demons, a gaggle of demons. I don't know what a group of demons is called. Once everyone had arrived, the women, the demons, the animals, they would begin having sex with one another. The ministers truly described this part in lurid detail. The witches would slaughter stolen babies and drink their blood as they celebrated the Catholic Mass in reverse order, just to be sure and desecrate it. These stories were very effective in getting out the message that witches were a threat. One imagines that in the pubs, men might ask, "Hey, can you go over that sex part again?" But it wasn't just the stories. Artists depicted the witches' Sabbaths. Preachers spoke out against them. The stories got into the culture. Literate and illiterate, peasant and owning class, everybody heard the stories about the witches' Sabbath. It began to be culturally accepted. The water that they swam in, they just assumed it must be true. It seems every bad thing, in fact, came to be blamed on witches. Pope Innocent VIII famously issued what sometimes is called the Witches' Bull of 1484, which sanctioned the punishing of witches as heretics. And he wrote, "Many persons of both sexes, unmindful of their own salvation and straying from the Catholic faith, have abandoned themselves to devils, incubi and succubi, and by their incantations, spells, and such, have slain infants yet in the mother's womb, as also the offspring of cattle, have blasted the produce of the earth, nay, men and women, beasts of burden, herd beasts, as well as animals of other kinds, vineyards, orchards, wheat, and all other cereals. These wretches furthermore afflict and torment men and women." And he goes on. "They hinder men from performing the sexual act and women from conceiving." And on and on and on. So the church-sanctioned inquisitors would come to town and announce their presence in a sermon in which they chalked up every bad thing that had happened in that town recently to the activity of witches. And you better believe everybody in town did everything they could to attend that sermon. Because if you weren't there, well, what were you doing? Neighbors were pressured to turn in neighbors for any sort of suspicious activity or absences from town activities. When the inquisitors asked questions, they usually assumed the truth of the stories spread, guilty until proven innocent. They would ask leading questions like, and this is an actual question, "How often have you had sexual congress with demons?" While torturing the subject, guilt was assumed. Though there is not, to this day, not a scintilla of evidence that anything like a witch's Sabbath ever happened, it became culturally accepted fact. Inquisitors became folk heroes in some instances, people who risked their lives to rid the world of the influence of Satan. Pursuit of witches began in the mid-1400s and went on for 200 years, and tens of thousands of people were killed in Western Europe and later in the United States. Maybe the Catholic Church, in the case of the witches' Sabbath, initiated what Marxist theorist Antonio Gramsci later called cultural hegemony. Basically, he said that the ruling class has a set of stories that benefit them and their perception of the way things are. Those stories make their way out into the culture and begin to be repeated as facts. The stories become filters through which people view experience and through which people view their neighbors. The stories are said to benefit everyone. Witches are to blame, let's kill them and things will get better. When in reality, the only people really benefiting are the ruling class. In the case of the witches' Sabbath, the stories were useful to the ruling clergy, and that they might keep people from questioning God and the church when their children died. It wasn't God, it was Satan and these agents of Satan. It would be nice to think we're past all that, but I don't think so. I came from a family of Midwestern truck drivers and factory workers. As a kid in the 80s, I watched as people in my town started to lose their jobs. The Ford plant closed. The RCA plant became Victor, and then it closed, or some French company took it over. The General Motors plant downsized drastically. More than half of those jobs were lost. I watched and I listened as some people blamed immigrants. Talk radio picked it up. It was on mass media, right? So it must be true. Immigrants are taking our jobs. Rush Limbaugh's proud ditto heads called in and agreed something had to be done about immigration. A wall seemed like a good idea. Force them through the desert. Make it really hard for them to cross where it's safe. And Clinton finally tried that. The story was repeated on the street, was repeated at dinner tables, it became accepted truth. The fact is, and it's clear now, that American politicians and CEOs were selling their own workers down the river in favor of cheaper labor somewhere else. But the story that people from other countries were taking Hoosier jobs, jobs in Indiana, American jobs, benefited the bosses in those places. And now, a potential presidential candidate accuses immigrants of being mostly rapists and murderers and has gathered large crowds and seems to have tapped into something deep in the American spirit maybe for some folks. Maybe the same need to blame and believe that the witches' Sabbath tapped into. I'm not sure they're so different. This has everything to do with Unitarian Universalism in our day and time. We don't live in the dark ages, but we do live in a time in which there are dark clouds on the horizon. Our economy is shifting from production to service. There are people who have lost their jobs, who will never have another job like the one they lost. And they aren't trained to do much else. Our climate is changing. We're more mobile and less likely to be in close-knit family groups. Midwesterners are facing more rain, more intense storms. We in the West are facing deadly temperatures and drought. In times of change and fear, it's easy for scapegoat stories to spread and to become accepted fact because people want an easy scapegoat. We want a simple solution. And when the stories are sanctioned by influential groups like the media and religion and political candidates, when they enter our culture, many people can't even see anymore that they're not true or that they might not be true. So it seems to me we're called by our faith to do two things in times like these. First, to continually and relentlessly challenge any accepted truth about another, especially accepted truths about groups of people. To remain vigilant in questioning. And second, to speak out when someone conveys a witch's Sabbath story to us. We can make a difference, one story at a time, one relationship at a time. May we have the courage to do so.